Why has the issue of sadistic mass rape on British soil reared its ugly head once again, this time on the international front? There are many reasons, but one is fundamental: the increasingly desperate need in the West for a serious discussion about the perils of an unthinking and self-aggrandizing multiculturalism, a word that in itself is primarily cliched advertisement for the self-proclaimed admirable and wondrous tolerance of the progressive hypocrites on the left and right alike. It's time for us in the free world to look at human beings and their various cultures as they truly are, and not as the good thinkers wish and then so dangerously insist that they must be. This means laying out the stark reality not only of cultural differences, but of the proclivity of the worst of people who are very bad indeed to use religious affiliation as camouflage for their machinations. This is a temptation regarded by the ancients as paramount, the use of God's name in vain, which the confused assume merely means don't swear, but which truly means do not claim virtue when pursuing the lowest of selfish ends. This is the sin of the Pharisees as well, who literally became murderous when Christ called them on their hypocrisy. There's arguably no more widespread pathology of aim plaguing us in the developed world today, excepting perhaps that of pride. It's also the case that manipulators, those for example who cry victim at the drop of a hat, as well as outright criminals, are highly prone to cloak themselves in the guise of moral virtue. That's exactly what puts the most extreme con in the most exceptional of con men. Before we elaborate on that point, let's establish a few more basic and simultaneously indisputable facts. First, democracy is by no means the natural state of man and woman. The vast majority of countries around the world are barely countries at all in the modern Western sense of the world. They are instead far too often unproductive totalitarian hellholes run by thugs and inhabited in the main by the sort of people who either allow themselves to be ruled by the hedonistic and power-mad, or who are so beaten down and corrupted themselves that they envision progress merely as the opportunity to rise and perpetuate the same crooked game, this time as victors. Let us second abandon the naive and idiot pretense that women are easily integrated as full and equal partners into functional and productive marriages, families, and states, and that such integration is also a default condition. Here's an alternative view, which, as in the case of religious and moral hypocrisy, is much more natural. In the absence of constant and disciplined future and community-oriented socialization, sexual desire runs rampant, not least among young single men, along with all the other forms of present-focused hedonistic and power-mad behavior. Hence the well-established association between the proclivity to rape and otherwise assault and more general criminal conduct. Self-centered immaturity is the rule, not civilized, self-disciplined conduct. The same can be said of foolishness as opposed to wisdom. Under the dominion of the immature, unprotected women are not only fair game, particularly when foreign, but responsible by the very fact of their solitary status and self-evidently wicked attractiveness for whatever dire fate might befall them. This means not only the rape and sadistic abuse of said women, but their blaming and shaming for the provocative fact of their solitariness. This is the default defense and worldview of the worst of men. She was asking for it. A society where women can bring their talents to the table as independent, safe, and respected individuals requires, by contrast, certain stringent psychological and social preconditions: a widely shared view of the value of women as equal intrinsically to men, a police and justice system with genuine integrity, material and more specifically hygienic standards associated only with industrialized societies. It also requires effective birth control and the mores that allow or even encourage its use. These conditions are prohibitively difficult to meet. Furthermore, their existence is taken for granted at our extreme peril, with particularly severe ramifications for the poorly defended and female. None of these preconditions apply in the default oppressive authoritarian society where intercourse of any sort between men and women is severely restricted and punished, and all forms of sexual psychopathology flourish in no small consequence. It is nonetheless from precisely such societies that much of the mass immigration that characterizes many Western countries occurs and has for decades, in consequence of the idiot presumption that these mobile and often desperate people will bring with them none of the terrible presumptions and customs they are hypothetically fleeing. Consider in that regard the 195 countries that currently make up the world. A mere 24 of these are true Western democracies, characterized by respect for and existence of freedom, human rights, limited government, separation of church and state, and rule of law. That's 1 in 8, or 12%. That alone proves that such rule-governed, classically liberal democracy is the exception, strongly indicating at the same time that the absence of democratic attitude and social order, rather than its presence, must be assumed as the default. The naive and reflexively self-aggrandizing Westerner, striving above all to consider him or herself in the best possible light, proclaims instead that deep in the chest of every oppressed person beats a heart longing for responsible freedom. But a totalitarian state is in truth a distributed network of deceit and cruel oppression more than a mere top-down hierarchy of power. Everyone in a tyranny lies about everything, all the time, to everyone, including themselves and those whom they claim to love. This is why removing the putative head, the most obvious dictator in the revolutionary manner, remember the Arab Spring or the liberalism of Libya and Iraq, most frequently produces chaos or even worse, suppression. There are many pathways, personal and communal, to rigidity and instability, and very few to responsible freedom, abundance, and progress. Thus, immigrants from authoritarian states are most likely to bring with them authoritarian attitudes. 24 genuine free democracies. What of the remaining 171, or 88% of the world's countries? 59 of them are fully authoritarian, replete with all the horrors such systems entail. Another 20 are chaotic, failed states. The remainder are at best a mixed bag, not fully authoritarian, not entirely chaotic, but certainly not thriving democracies, and certainly not the Western countries that the oppressed or predatory of the world flee to, given a choice. What are the cultural preconditions for civil society and good governance? What cultural features characterize the 24 versus the rest, particularly the worst of the rest? 40 of 50, or 80% of Muslim-majority countries are fully and unabashedly authoritarian. A mere 3 of the remainder are democracies, Morocco, Turkey, and Indonesia. If the definition is allowed to be approximate and generous, the rest are at best a mixed bag. And what of majority Protestant or Catholic countries? 100% of these, Africa accepted and reasonably so, are highly functional free societies. Observation of a track record like that might suggest to a genuinely objective observer a causal connection. Why the stark difference? None of even the possible reasons look good for those who proclaim that the rewards of multiculturalism are untrammeled and certain. First, in the Islamic world, divine law, Sharia, rules. And it is indisputably the case that the more fundamentalist accounts of Sharia, and potentially all accounts, don't mesh easily with the democratic idea of man-made laws subject to change and improvement by consensual and voluntary agreement. For Islamist supremacists, God's law, by their interpretation of course, is regarded as immutable and superordinate to any human legislation. Does this presumption not stand in virtually absolute opposition to a foundational democratic idea? The sovereignty of the people? Some might argue that shura, the Islamic principle of consultation, is akin to democracy. However, akin to is by no means identical with, and such differences matter in the case of fundamental principles, and they matter a lot. Shura is traditionally a consultation among a select group of Islamic scholars or leaders, and not an electoral process involving universal suffrage. It is therefore not a voluntarily accepted social contract subject to equally voluntary update and change, but a variant form of top-down elite-imposed governance or tyranny. The historical method of leadership selection in the Islamic world, think of the caliphs, clearly and indisputably reflects this elitism. The same can be said regarding the imams. If such bending of the knee among such people and in such states was truly to the one God ruling validly forever from on high, something might still be said for it, at least among those who claim religious inspiration. A thorny problem remains, however, the word of God according to whom? Islamic totalitarianism, which is far too often ruled by immature and hedonistic thug, is likewise far too often submission to the thug's interpretation of God. This leaves precisely as much room for disagreement about the divine as thugs might be expected to allow, which is none or else. The idea that Islam should govern all aspects of life, from personal behavior to state laws, also directly conflicts with the democratic principle of pluralism and freedom to choose. Remember as well, in keeping with all this, that the punishment for rejecting these claims, the price paid for apostasy, is not infrequently death. There is no manner in which any of this self-evidently aligns with the Western principles of freedom of thought, religion, and expression. Therefore, it seems incumbent on those who believe that such commensurability exists to prove that it does, particularly given the aforementioned statistical difference between Muslim and Christian majority societies, rather than insisting that the burden of proof be put on the skeptic of the multicultural project. The difference between the societies under consideration, bad as it is in general, is clearly worse for women. Traditional Islamic jurisprudence assigns very different rights and roles to men and women. The typical woman in the authoritarian Muslim countries generally requires a male guardian's permission to marry, travel, or work. Their inheritance share is lesser, typically half. Men can divorce unilaterally with ease, while women cannot.